I'm sorry that the vineyard in the bulletin is misspelled. Doesn't speak too much for the proofreader, who is me. But anyways, just apologize for that misspelling. This parable of the workers in the vineyard has several interpretations, and I'd like to at least cover a couple of them this morning. When Jesus said at the end of the parable, "The last shall be first and the first shall be last," read by Robin this morning, he was driving home the point that your salvation, no matter when it arrives in your lifetime, no matter when you decide to give your life to Christ, is just as important as the one who received it perhaps many years before yours. God has no timetable for eternity. The person who receives Christ at a later stage in life, even in the final chapter of life, is not any less prepared for eternity than the person who received Christ much earlier in life and has faithfully and conscientiously lived a Christian life and has performed the duties of a Christian for decades. The grace of God teaches us that Christ promises eternity no matter the hour, day, or age, if one genuinely receives Christ into his or her heart. Paul says in Ephesians, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves is the gift of God." I've seen many people over my career turn their spiritual attitudes around much later in life. It doesn't matter, as I said, the time or the hour. God celebrates when it happens. Paul said in 2 Corinthians, "Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." So whatever time or station in your life that you receive Christ is equally important in God's eyes. And secondly, if you think in the form of comparison to others, that is, your salvation is more worthy than others because you've been at it longer, then you might consider the warning at the end of the parable, "The first shall be last." And this would apply to the comparisons that the workers make with one another after they finish a hard day's work in the fields, some working, as the parable tells us, more hours than others. So let's imagine for a minute this scenario. You go to work and you clock in at 8 a.m. and you clock out at 5 p.m. You receive your agreed upon wage for the number of hours you worked. Then a few others come in for work, but later in the day, clock in at noon, perhaps check out at 5, clock out at 5, but were paid the same number of hours that you were paid, although you worked 9 hours and they worked 5 hours. Consider the possible feelings swirling around in your head: unfairness, unjust, resentment, anger, maybe even hurt. You did due diligence in putting in a good hard day's work, but the other guys worked about half the time that you worked, but got paid the same. Where is the justice in all of this? The parable of the workers in the vineyard is an even more extreme example of the inconsistency of the wages paid out at the end of the day, but remains one of my favorite parables because it deals with the fundamental human temptation to compare, to match ourselves up against the other person, and to quietly envy the fact that he or she has something that I would like or has received an undeserved preferential treatment. But the inclination to compare throws up spiritual roadblocks all over the place. This parable emphasizes that. It also emphasizes the grace and generosity of God. Let's review the parable again. The vineyard owner hires a bunch of guys to work in the fields, kind of like the guy going down to the employment office and rounding up a bunch of workers for the day. They agree on a wage. Then after about 3 hours, the man determines he needs more workers to finish the job in the vineyard, so he employs a few more who are just kind of hanging out in the marketplace waiting for someone to hire them, and he tells them that he's going to pay them a fair wage. And then he brings, after the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he brings in more guys to help with the project. But the capper of the parable seems to be in the 11th hour, when he finds yet more who are standing idle, probably desperately in need of work, and the owner brings them on to finish the job. And finally, at the end of the day, all the workers, of course, show up to collect their pay. And lo and behold, the owner gives everybody the same pay. Even the guys who came in at the 11th hour received the same amount as the guys who came in at the crack of dawn. As the parable goes, the guys who had been there all day were fuming. They could not believe what they just witnessed. Sweating it out in the hot sun the entire day and getting the same amount of money as the guys who were there just for 1 hour. Now, on the surface, this principle seems unjust and unfair, not unlike what we said at the beginning of the sermon. Imagine yourself in the same situation. But Jesus doesn't want us to think in terms of justice in regard to this parable and who got the special favors. He wants us to dwell on instead the generosity and the compassion of the owner and not the comparison to others. Jesus doesn't want us to think that these workers were belittled in favor of the ones who worked less but got the same. But instead, he wants us again to consider and to contemplate and to embrace the compassion of the owner. Jesus also doesn't want us to dwell on matching ourselves up against another person. Well, he got this and I got that. He wants us to contemplate a much higher standard to which we can compare ourselves to Jesus himself. Now let's go back and consider the generosity of the owner. First of all, he gave those who worked for him a decent wage, and we can imagine, even though it's a parable, that he took good care of them during the course of the day, making sure they had enough food and rest and water. But his goodness was equal to his generosity because of his knowledge that these men who he picked up in the 3rd and the 6th and the 11th hours were in need of work, but just couldn't find it. So in sympathizing with these men's situation, he decided to give them a full day's wage just to help them out. Then the floodgates opened, and a storm of complaints came from the workers who had been there all day. How could you do this to us? Well, nothing was really done to them. They were just envious of the guys who worked less but got paid the same. It was about envy. And finally, the owner, who's perplexed by all this bickering among his bickering workers, he says, am I not allowed to do with what I choose with what belongs to me? Aren't I allowed to do what I need to do, what I want to do? Or are you envious because I am so generous? C.S. Lewis has a good section about this subject in his book, Mere Christianity. It's a chapter called The Great Sin being pride. He writes, maybe you've heard this before, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only of having more of it than the next person. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer, cleverer, better looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich or clever or good looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It is a comparison, he said, that makes you proud. The pleasure of being above the rest. Those workers in the field, you see, would have been perfectly content if the other guys hadn't shown up in the later hours. Now they had something to compare, and they didn't like the comparison. Again, it is comparing our situation to others, and God sees that as a very debilitating obstacle to spiritual progress. The laborers were not grateful for the opportunity to work and get paid for their work. Instead, they griped about their lot, about their comparison to the other workers, until the owner finally told them to get their act together, to stop feeling sorry for themselves and to get on with their lives. You know, in a modern sense, although Facebook is a marvelous way to connect with one another, it can also create a temptation to compare your life with others. The one who has just returned, for instance, from a 10-day vacation to the Bahamas, which is great, or the one who has just climbed a 14er, or the one who received a significant promotion in his or her company, or the one whose son or daughter received an academic or an athletic scholarship to a major university, or the person who just announced his retirement at age 45, or the friend who reveled in his bonus at the end of the year. Of course, we know that these are highlight reels of people's lives, and they can easily leave out all the tough things that are going on in their life too. A study by the Happiness Research Institute has found that people who are on Facebook are 39% more likely to feel less happy than their friends who aren't. The simple reason is that many have a tendency to compare their lives with others more than looking at their own strengths and gifts and potential within their own reach. The litany of comparisons could include, I'm not as successful as my friends are in work. I'm not as athletic. I'm not as wealthy. I don't have a nice enough house. My kids, I discover, aren't as accomplished. I don't travel that much, I guess. I'm not as talented. But Jesus tells us in this parable that the comparison race is a race that you will never win. But he does imply that you should compare the generosity of the owner with the complaints of the workers, who, although they received their just wages, still couldn't get over their envy of others. Which one sounds better? The generous owner or the pettiness of the workers? We come out of this parable feeling a lot better about ourselves and our relationships to others if we focus on the grace and the generosity of the owner, therefore the grace and generosity of God. One writer, Margie Worrell, writes about her own struggle with envy and comparisons. She wrote, growing up in a small farm in rural Australia, I often pined the excitement of the urban life my cousins had in the city a day's drive away. She would say to her mother, they get to go roller skating, I only get to go horse riding. To which my mother would reply, Margaret Mary, never compare yourself. It makes you either vain or bitter. Later, the writer would say that if you're still wrestling with comparisons and envy of others, being open about it and honest about it ultimately helps us to realize the futility of comparisons and the gifts in each other. We all have our mountains to climb, she said. We all have fears to conquer. We all have paths to forge. So run your own race. And I would add to that, run the race with Christ, and you will end up comparing yourself to just one person, him. And when you do that, if you haven't already done it, it will change your life.